everybody here this morning to a wonderful morning. We haven't got the rain that we had a fortnight ago. A fortnight ago we cowered under the shelter and said, well, God put himself on the watering roster this week. And we left it at that. There's a lot of space down here if you're able to sit on the floor. I'm not volunteering to do that, my hips won't let me, but if you're able to, please come and make yourself comfortable.
We'll be talking for an hour or so, stand up if you're happy standing up, feel free to come. These are community cushions, so it doesn't matter that it's not one of yours, feel free to jump on one.
If you haven't already signed in to our sign-in book, please make sure that you do. I think we'll pass it around as the talk is happening. Please make sure you put your name and some way that we can contact you, preferably an email address, so that we can keep you updated with future projects and workshops. The reason we want your name is not to hound you, not at all, but we need to show the City of Joondalup that this is a worthwhile project and that people like it. And if we don't have an indication that people attended, if we just count heads, they'll say, yeah, right, you can write a number, that's great. No, they need to know that there were real people here and that the support is ongoing and regular. We are very grateful recipients of the funding for the workshops for this year, and we want to demonstrate to them that it would be a good idea if they did it again. So, without much more ado, thank you very much for coming. Welcome to Charles and Jolene, who are going to present us a workshop about gardening like forest.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kat. Thanks to DEG and thanks to the City of Joondalup for sponsoring the talks. Jolene, my wife, and I are working with Terra Perma, a little permaculture-based business, education, teaching, building community gardens, setting up school gardens, all that kind of good stuff. And I guess it's certainly worth mentioning Permaculture West, which is the Permaculture Association of WA, which is a not-for-profit. And if you head to the internet, have a look at those guys. I was the co-convener for 3 years and now the treasurer. And we've got various other members of the Permaculture West committee here. I guess that group is an umbrella group for sustainability in Perth. So we're talking about solar passive home design, food production, and creating livable, enjoyable communities and growing community fabric. So community gardens like this are an excellent part of that community fabric and skill sharing. And hopefully the City of Joondalup can have some more community gardens with the confidence that this little pilot scheme is successful. So. That's why we're trying to build momentum here, and all the support that you can give this group is excellent. So today, food forests, or a lot of concepts that can be grouped under food forests. So we want to talk about things like companion planting. We want to talk about interplanting plants. We want to talk about plant stacking, so the idea of arranging plants towards the sun so that the tall trees are at the back and the short plants are at the front. So we're sharing the sunlight. So intelligent planting of our trees and our vegetative systems. So yes, that an orchard idea is that we have one tree and then a big gap and then one tree and then a big gap and then one tree. That's a very agricultural idea of food production and fruit production. And they need that kind of uniformity to make their harvesting and other things like that viable. But it's not what we need in really tight spaces in urban backyards. We need to be better using the resources, whether it's the sun and the water, or whether it's the soil. A lot of people have 5 by 5 metres in their backyard, and that's their garden space. So I guess I like the idea of, instead of going for sort of gimmicky ideas like vertical planters, little tiny pots spread on a wall that dry out in 5 seconds flat in summer. Nature has been vertically gardening for quite some time. It's called a forest, and the most effective vertical garden is a forest edge, where you've got the tall trees and the shorter bushes, and it's going into grasslands. So it's a really productive space. So the concept of forest gardening is we look at that kind of space where we've got tall trees, medium trees, herbs, ground covers, and a whole bunch of diverse ecosystem animals and insects that support all that diversity there, and it makes for a really productive space. So we look at that, we're looking for patterns in nature. Permaculture, which is sort of where I come from, the permaculture thinking, another term for it is biomimicry. So we're trying to copy nature. Nature has gone through this process of evolving really effective, efficient systems, and we can look at those patterns and how it's done that, and base our plantings and our designs on that pattern, but using species that are more useful to humans. So in a forest, it might be really useful to the forest ecology, but in an urban food forest, we've got very limited space, so we want to be making sure that those plants are there for our purpose and nature's purpose, or they're at least there for the plants. So nitrogen fixing plants helping build fertility in the soil, or beneficial plants bringing in insects and pollinators. You know, they're all there for a very defined purpose. Now, towards the end of this workshop, we'll talk about plants that you could put together with some idea of a plant guild, and but that's in a Mediterranean climate. That's a work in progress for everyone. So we're all on this journey together at this point. There's very little in books. There's lots of good food forestry books on temperate climates and areas where there's frost for 3 months. That is not Perth, and if you copy those models, we won't have a particularly good system. We need to be looking to Greece and other Mediterranean climates to see how they worked in the past when this was important to them, and I guess looking at their systems and then modelling some new ones for Perth. Some of you will have notes. Now, we only printed off about 30, so the notes will all be on the internet. So if you go to terraperma.com.au, go to our pre-workshop notes, you'll find the workshop note for this workshop and for all of the workshops we've done. So a lot of things we'll gloss over today because they really aren't on topic, but they are critical. Things like soil building, how we set up our sand so it can hold the fertility to have systems like a productive food forest. It's very easy to have a food forest in Pemberton on beautiful loamy clay soils. Much more challenging, much more thinking is needed in the plant's choice and the soil amendment choice if you're going to do it on sand dunes, which is effectively what we're doing in Perth. This would have never grown a productive food forest here. It would have been a low yield coastal shrubs or inland, open tundra type arrangement. There would never have been a high productive human food crop, and that is why the Aboriginals were so migratory. They had to move with the seasons because there just wasn't enough food in any place at any time. So we don't have that luxury. If you call that a luxury, perhaps not. We don't have that capability anymore. We're stuck in one place. So we really need to start improving that place and the soil and the capacity and the intelligence of the design there so we can get a, let's say, sustainable, long-term yield from our tight urban spaces. So that's what the idea of food forest is about. It's a fairly fluffy term, but the idea is really intelligent copying of how a forest works and how all the plants are working together. So one of the key topics I get asked about a lot is companion planting and what are the guaranteed lists of companion plants. And the bad news to some degree is there is no guaranteed list of companion plants. What you should be thinking about is plants that are not in direct competition. That's the key here. So if we plant 2 broccolis next to each other, those broccolis are using the same sunlight, the same minerals, the same water, everything. So those 2 plants are in competition with each other. If we plant a broccoli and a carrot, suddenly we've got a different plant family, different pests and diseases, we've got different foliage, we've got a root crop and a fruit crop or a greens crop. So you can see how that's really where companion planting should be being thought of. Certainly you can put basil with tomatoes, and I like eating basil and tomatoes, and it's probably a useful companion. But we're a little bit more sophisticated than that today. We're going to be talking about trees, shrubs, bushes, herbaceous layers, root crops in the ground, and possibly vines as well. So it's not just two plants together, we're talking about a whole arrangement of resource-sharing plants. When you look at Perth, we have a huge resource. It's that big ball of flaming stuff in the sky, but in summer it's in excess. So part of the benefit of a food forest is we can actually share that resource better too. So instead of having fruit trees out by themselves, and we always plant them like that, that's just what we do. So fruit tree, fruit tree, fruit tree, and they get incinerated in summer. If it's not the sun, it's the dry wind that blows by them, or it's the fact that you just can't mulch them deep enough to keep the moisture in. So it would be far better to be planting what we would call a guild. Yep. And it's on. I don't really think I need a microphone, but it will give us better sound feed. So the idea is that instead of just planting a tree, we plant a bunch of plants together and they're all helping each other. So what do we think of when we think of a tree? It's this idea of, I guess, we call it yield. What are you going to get out of the fruit tree? So we think about, let's say, an apple. So if I'm, a good way to plan these kinds of things, think about and work our way through a design is this idea of mind mapping. So if we think about a tree, what are the uses of a tree? Tree, maybe it's an apple, doesn't matter too much. Anyone got some, so what are we planting an apple tree for? Fruit, alright, so that's the obvious one, definitely. Fruit, apples.
Shade.
Shade, yep, love that. What kind of sort of characteristic?
Don't spell apple like that.
Why not? It's not my strong point. Design is. So we've got deciduous. Yeah, that's what. So what is it about the apple's foliage? It's, the deciduousness is also interesting. Yeah. Yep. So we've got shade. We've got deciduous, and you'll have to bear with my spelling. Leaf drop, mulch. So we're looking at. So we've got shade, we've also got this effect. So does everyone know what deciduous is? It just means the plants that are dropping their leaves in winter. It's a mechanism that comes from colder climates where there was frozen soils, and if they didn't drop all the sap out of their leaves and out of their trunk, then you know what happens when things freeze and water expands? So in the plants, if they don't drop the sap out in winter, that all expands and the plant dies. So any plants coming from frozen landscapes, which is most of those deciduous trees, they had that mechanism so that they didn't die in winter. So that mechanism is useful to us because it gives us a different characteristic. What else have we got from an apple tree, or any tree?
The wood.
The wood? Yeah, you'll talk to any woodsman and they'll say apple tree wood is beautiful to work with. If you can get it, smoking, lovely. So it's more than just wood, it's carving, smoking. What else have we got that apple trees or fruit trees do?
Shelter.
Sorry?
Shelter.
Shelter, lovely. Yep, definitely. So we talk about a food forest and we're starting to think about canopy trees and other things like that, and that might be that gum tree. But really in a backyard, the canopy is probably going to be fruit trees. You know, we're probably going to be looking at the biggest tree we might have is a deciduous pecan tree, which is 6 metres high. And that's already getting too big for most backyards. So more likely we're going to be looking at deciduous apricot or an evergreen orange or something like that. 3 metre high canopy. We really want to be able to just about reach all the fruit and be able to maintain the plant and prune it. So once it gets above 3 metres, it's already out of that range. So, you know, these plants, these are our canopy species, these fruit trees. They are our shelter. We should be looking to use them to give us shade in summer, so we can grow more sensitive plants underneath. So instead of having a shade cloth, you know, let's just plant trees and manage the pruning of these trees so that we allow some light through, filtered light, which is exactly what we need for growing veggies in winter, in summer. What else have we got? Flowers, so they flower.
Bees.
So bees, we all know the plight of the bees. It's not so bad in Australia, but it's chronic elsewhere. We want to be looking after them and giving them some food. Shade. Sorry?
Trellis for things to grow up.
Trellis, yep, trellis or structure. So when it does go deciduous, there's actually an empty tree there that you could put vines up in winter. There's lots of climbing beans and leguminous plants that can help the system in winter. I guess the idea, we'll talk about it more, but the vining layer, there's quite a difference between a passion fruit, which is a perennial thing that needs a huge structure and gets really big and obliterates everything, and say trellising up a pumpkin, which is there for 3 or 4 months, or a gourd, or something smaller. So one can work with trees and one tends to kill trees. Oxygen, oh yeah, that's pretty important. So that useful oxygen. I can't think and write at the same time either. What else have we got?
Beneficial.
Habitat.
Yeah, habitat for insects.
Habitat, lovely. So I guess
Soil health.
soil health for sure. That's probably with the mulching.
Wind protection.
Wind, lovely. So you can see we can just look at the fact that an apple tree produces us apples. So we go to the nursery and we're trying to figure out what we want to buy for our backyard, and we're picking some fruit trees. But really, I guess what I want you to think about is that fruit tree is offering a whole lot more than just the apples. So when we pick something like a cherry, which has very marginal capability of producing any fruit anyway, because we love cherries, it's not a very good choice of a tree. It's an unhappy tree that's not really producing fruit in Perth. So when you think about other trees, think about all the other benefits that something could give us that's growing well and is healthy. So this is the way we look at trees when we're trying to plan guilds or plant around them. We want to be looking at the characteristics of the tree, so the idea that it's deciduous, maybe what level of canopy is it, so what kind of shade are we getting, what kind of shelter are we getting. We're looking at these plant characteristics and thinking about them in a bit more detail. We're trying to integrate other things with it, so we need to know what the plant's going to grow up to be like. Or at least we need to know how we're going to prune the plant to make it a productive space underneath it. Citrus, we would know that it's evergreen and we would start to be thinking about its height. And we're starting to think that it's a bulk feeder. So a citrus has shallow roots and it is really draining of the system around it. So can we plant highly productive vegetable systems right underneath it? The idea, I guess, is we're trying not to be in competition. So if the citrus is a bulk feeder, we probably want to plant plants underneath it that are actually there to benefit the orange rather than to benefit us. So we can't plant tomatoes and broccoli and other things where we're getting a big yield from that plant, because then it's in direct competition with the orange. So think about what we're trying to get out of the system.
Just a note on that with the orange. In India, they were planting grains under oranges
Yep.
to train the roots to go down.
Oh, yeah.
Then they would cut the grains, and that would be a mulch.
Training the citrus roots or the wheat roots?
Training the citrus roots. By competition, the orange tree would actually go down and seek of water. Yep. Which is probably applicable for us.
It certainly is, yeah. Yeah, so there's so much manipulation that goes on, and as I said, this idea of plant guilds is a great one, but it's an open space for thinking about it. In the back of your notes, there's some ideas there, but it really is about looking at the plants and looking at what you're trying to achieve out of the system and having a best guess. So all we're going to get to at the end of today is a best guess. What we've got to do is we've actually got to do something, have a best guess, look at the plant characteristics, look at some companion plants that we can put with it, some for insects, some for birds, some for the soil. Chuck them together, hopefully in the right orientation to the sun, so they're sharing that resource. And then wait. Nature is beautiful in the fact that it gives feedback. A lot of people don't give much feedback now because it seems inappropriate to tell people when they're failing. Nature doesn't suffer that problem. It's quite happy to give feedback. Now, if we design based on the patterns of sunlight and fertility and natural systems and natural succession of plants, the feedback from nature is going to be something that's useful to us. So we're going to learn from that. If we go against everything that nature does, the feedback from nature is catastrophic. And when we have catastrophic failure and everything goes wrong, we don't tend to learn. We tend to shut down and say, well, that was a failure, I can't garden, I'm out of here. So I guess that's why I say it's a best guess. So we use a bit of intelligence, we try and set our systems up intelligently with this idea of the food forest, which I'm getting into. That gives nature the ability to give us some useful feedback.
I have a PhD and big, but every time that comes up, I cannot eat
Fruit fly?
it. And I don't know whether we chop it down or eat it.
Well, that's certainly a key management issue is fruit fly and other pests in Perth, and that's one of the reasons why I say if we've got a canopy species that's above 3 metres, how do we protect it? How do we put a net over it to keep parrots out, or how do we put a net over it to keep fruit fly out? We can individually net the fruit, but we still need to be able to access it. So I guess the advice in something like that was look at your system, because it depends, but I'd be looking to prune that plant down and then control its size so you can actually protect 50 pairs and eat 50 pairs, not have 300 pairs that go to waste every year. Yeah, that's right, so it's not useful. So that's the thing, and that's why if we're talking about a big canopy species that's protecting our whole backyard, let's say you've got a huge backyard, we might actually choose a tree that doesn't have fruit because we can't get up there to manage it anyway. We might pick a plant like a jacaranda or a leditsia or a Kipuana tipu, a rosewood. All of those plants with deciduous leaf drop that let sunshine in winter and keep it a bit shaded in summer, that we're not up there trying to get fruit out of those big trees. They could be 20 metres in the air and that could be not a problem for us. So that's why there is some thought process to this, and that's why in a food forest the canopy species is not normally what I call monkey food. So if we're monkeys, which is a bit rude, but we eat the same sort of stuff, in the forest we're in that kind of monkey zone. We're not up in the canopy with the birds and otherwise. So the thought about trees and what yield is, hopefully you're starting to think that the yield of apple tree is not just the fruit. There's the habitat it brings, the shade it offers, and all those sorts of things. The other thing to think about is we think about the top structure of trees. That's often mirrored in the bottom structure of trees. So the root systems. It's nice if we know a little bit about root systems. Deciduous trees, a lot of our trees have a deeper root system than something like a citrus, which has a shallow, plate-like, maybe 30 centimetres, half a metre deep root system. That's literally all the citrus has. So if we just have a citrus on deep sand, let's say our sand is 20 or 30 metres deep, once the nutrients in the water escape that citrus tree, so half a metre down at best, that's it. It's all over, they're gone. Whereas if we can have some bigger trees, even if people think they're in competition like a big gum tree, at least we know that gum tree's actually got some roots that go down 10 metres. So that the water that was lost from the system is actually piped back up to the system. So, yes, there's this conversation of competition and, why would we have a gum tree? It's certainly not a good choice, but it might be there already. Recognise that a gum tree is again offering all these different yields. No fruit, but lots of other yields. We just need to have management practices for the gum tree to control the composting of the leaves and to control the highly competitive root growth. But it's just a different decision process. So we talked about vertical gardening. Often vertical gardening is fancy little pots on a wall. The problem with those is They each have about a litre of soil in them, and they work fine in winter, and then they dry out in summer. You can put as much water as you want on there. You can water them 3 times a day. They're still spoilers in summer. They might be a suitable technique on the south side of your house in full shade, that kind of space, if you can get some plants to grow there. A lot of people have a lot of vertical space on triplexes, double stories, so we need to be using that space, but I guess my preference is to, if the sun's over here, and this is your house wall, it's not really up to it. This is your house wall, so they go here. Why not be having vertical stacking, something like that? Trees naturally vertical stack. You can have something like a pomegranate. If you wanted some sun on the wall in winter to warm up the wall, pomegranate, guava, something lower, maybe tree kale or some of the kales or Cape gooseberries or something like that. And then some ground cover here, some English dandelion, some sweet potato, any of those sorts of things. And we're actually getting a lot of productivity out of what might only be 3 metres wide. So my preference for vertical gardening is that kind of technique rather than one that is pretty unnatural. This implies gardening, copying in nature of epiphytes and things that actually live in tiny little pockets in rainforest trees. Now there are plants that do that, but they live in wet rainforest areas, and that is not good. So this kind of technique, you can still have a huge block of soil down here. So the capacity to get a good amount of minerals and a good amount of water into that space and have healthy plants. So have a crack at these vertical gardens if you want, but recognise their limitations. And I'd certainly, nature doesn't have that kind of arrangement going on very often. One way to think about plants, so if we're thinking about how we put these plant guilds together, we're thinking about the structure. We can talk about food forests or arrangements of plants, which we might call a guild. A guild is just, so what's a guild? It's just an arrangement of plants that are working together, that are collaborating, that are not in direct competition, resource sharing plants. So that's what a guild is. So it's not a particular arrangement of the exact species. So I can give you some guilds, and there are some in the back of your notes. You can get some guilds off the internet, but really there is no direct answer to it. It's what works in your backyard based on your sun, soil, and your needs. So how much you're in the backyard and how much maintenance you can do. But the idea of thinking about guilds and coming up with how we might set up our plants and thinking about the plants in a bit more details, we can think about their form. So plant form, I'm thinking about shape, if you like. Anyone got any ideas of different plant forms? So not characteristics, what do I call them? Not functions, but the formation and the shape and the size of plants. We've got all different things. We've got canopy species or flat type plants that grow like this. So we've got that savanna type canopy plant naturally. That's a nice characteristic to know about. You see those trees in a lot of the car parks now, the Tijuana Tifu, that kind of plant that has a broad but flat canopy and is deciduous. That's a pretty nice plant characteristic to have above your food forest or your orchard area. It also is nice to think that those plants there are actually nitrogen fixers and pioneers. So the pioneer term is a plant that can go into very marginal, unhealthy soil and start to improve the fertility and shade the soil and bring a reason for insects and birds and other things to come in. So, this is a canopy. columnar. So a narrow, taller type plant. So that's, so we can have something really wide and broad, or we can have something narrow and tall. And I've got little plants in my backyard called the China, which is a nitrogen fixing ferny plant, which grows straight up within 3 years from seed. It's about 4 metres high. It's only about 2 metres wide, and that plant is giving flowers and seed to the garden. I've got it in my chicken run, so the seed's feeding the chickens. So it can quite comfortably grow in a similar space because it has a different shape. So if we talk about competition for sunlight, we're not trying to grow 2 canopy species on top of each other like this. We're actually growing a different shaped plant in with another different shaped plant. So this idea of different forms is important in our thinking. Other thing we might have is this idea of ground cover or ground layer. So something that's prostrate, something that grows along the ground. So if this is the soil here, this plant's pretty much growing there. So that's again using quite a different space to these plants. We've also got little bushes. So short plants, they could be deciduous or evergreen, meaning it could be a little blob or it could be a blueberry, which is deciduating in winter and giving us a different arrangement. So different plants have different forms. So if we talk about plant stacking and arranging plants. I'll just take this off. Does everyone understand the thought process? And we'll go through this in a bit more detail, that the sun's over there and the tallest plants should be on the south side of the sun. That's assuming that the sun is to the north in this hemisphere. The taller plants need to be at the back and the shorter plants need to be at the front if they're all going to get a crack at the sunlight, which is what we're about trying to achieve. So the term for that is plant stacking. Sometimes we might put a big deciduous tree out the front because we actually want more shade. But normally we're talking about the idea that we're going from tall, and they might be evergreen trees out the back, so that the shade is not going to affect our system. Might even have the tall deciduous trees out the front, but we're going for this kind of arrangement. In summer, it's more like coming straight down from 80 degrees. In winter, we were looking at more of a 30 degrees type of angle of the sun coming in. So see how low the sun is now. When we're planning this system, we need to plan for both times of year. So while shade is really good in summer because there's too much sun, we want to be getting more sunlight in winter because there's almost not enough sun coming in winter for a productive system. So that idea of plant stacking there, so you can understand that form, how the plant grows, what size it's going to be. So when you go to the nursery and you're asking what shape the tree is and how big it grows, that's pretty important information for this kind of arrangement. So what you might do after this, if you're interested, is go home and look at your spaces, and we'll talk about that shortly. Look at your spaces, figure out how the sun's moving through that space, map it out on a top-down satellite map with a program like Google Earth, Google Maps, or if you're in Joondalup, City of Joondalup's got a program called Intramaps. So if you go into the program called Intramaps and you put in your address, you'll see a satellite picture of your property with your trees and your house and your driveway, and it'll have a scale. So once we've got a satellite picture like that, we can start actually arranging some plants in there, some guesses, some guesswork. We can also look at the space and we can see the sun is panning through so we need to know where north is. We know the sun's going through the sky like that. If north is over there, the sun's going through the sky like that, and in winter it's going through the sky like that. So we can start to look at our block and the shade created by the house and the shade created by some big trees and maybe two-storey place next door. We can start to look at those shade factors. Too much sun, too little sun, maybe it gets too wet or too dry, but really we're probably thinking about sun and maybe hot, dry winds in summer. We can start to look at where those kind of spaces are on our block. once we're mapping those kind of spaces, we kind of know what plant characteristics or plant guilds we need to put in those spaces. The other thing we might look at when we're trying to figure out what guilds are and how plants work together is their function. So we talked about form, which is the shape. Function is more about what the plants do. So they might just do something by default, or we might put them there for a reason. So function, I might put borage in as an understory plant for making lots of carbon, because it's a vigorous plant, so lots of compost and mulch. I put it in for bees, brings in all the good bees, all the native bees and other things. But I'm not eating the borage. Some people eat borage, but I don't eat the borage. So I'm growing that plant that's a companion plant, if you like, or a beneficial plant for the plant systems in there. I'm growing carrots underneath, root crop. There's no reason why carrots can't be growing in. Most of the root crops are low demand crops, so we should be stacking in parsnips and carrots. And a lot of the species, umbilifer type species with that funny umbrella type flowering system. You think of carrots, if you've ever seen them going to flower, or coriander or parsnips, they're really good at bringing in beneficials as well. So we want to be putting them in even if we're not using them. But I guess the benefit is with herbs, the benefit is if we don't use them, they're there for nature. And I guess I'd encourage you with something like carrots and coriander. Parsley would, definitely. With those kind of plants, I'd encourage you to let them go to seed, let them flower. There's the idea that when something has stopped producing as much leaves as it could and is going to seed, that it's past its useful stage and we rip it out of the garden. It's past its feeding stage for us, but it's not past its useful stage in the ecology of the system. Those flowers are the exact thing that feeds the bees, feeds the native bees, it feeds the lacewings, it feeds the hoverflies. It feeds all of those beneficial predatory insects in your garden, the wasps and the other things that control the pests that we don't like. So if we don't leave food in there for the adult predators, so we see the ladybirds, larvae eating aphids, and we see the lacewing larvae eating aphids, and they eat aphids, but the adults actually need nectaries in the system. They'll also probably need some habitat to live in. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Do you have questions? Well, it could be. Do you use any sprays at all? Could be sprays. A lot of the sprays that we think are safe are not safe. They're a broad spectrum thing. Pyrethrum, garlic, chili, just about every spray we use will kill the predators as much or more than it kills the pests. Pests like aphids have a lifespan of days. They literally breed in millions in weeks. The predators that control them have a lifespan in weeks. It takes them weeks to build up. So if we hit with a spray, we kill the pests for a day, but we kill the predators for a month. So, spraying is not useful unless you have to, and I would say we never have to spray. If we have to spray, we're following the wrong kind of ideals. When we spray, we really interrupt the natural balance that's starting to happen. If we're talking food forests are an effort to put in, but in time these systems become self-reliant. Nature controls nature, nature feeds nature. Sunlight is free, and it rains in winter. It only rains in winter, fair enough. Those two resources are free, so there's no reason why, if we set up a system intelligently with some kind of amendment of the soil, so claying and organic matter so the soil can hold fertility and moisture, there's no reason why these systems can't provide us a yield for free. So we put in some work to set them up, but every year those systems become more and more fertile. And we can take a 10% tax out of the food forest and it doesn't even notice. what we tend to do then in time, we arrange these plants with plant guilds and with plant stacking, and we try and make them so they're not in direct competition. And in time, all we do is prune them so they don't smother each other and you know, compete for light again. So intelligent pruning to keep your pear tree from going 10 metres high. Perhaps we picked the wrong tree. You know, we should have picked a 3-metre tree, but we picked a 10-metre tree. Hey, that's what pruning's for. We could get a super extra dwarf and it would only ever be half a metre high. I'd rather have a tree that could get to 6 metres and prune it. Then I've got mulch, composting, vigorous trees, all of these useful things. But, you know, I need to do work because I've picked a tree that's going to grow bigger than the space I want it, you know, than I want it to do. Pruning most things down quite heavily and then managing their regrowth is okay. Certain trees will produce fruit on only last year's wood, but that's a limited number of trees. So if we're going to prune a tree that only fruits on last year's wood, we can't prune all of last year's wood off. So we get nice growth, but we never get any fruit. If you go to someone like Peter Coppin, who's a plant expert, if you go to his websites, I think you'll find information on which trees you need to prune in what manner. And certainly there's some quite good literature from universities in America that is quite applicable in that information. So it's the same pruning information. Oh, Coppin, yes, double P. He was involved in the apple tree breeding, worked for the Ag Department for years, and is now one of the key speakers in Great Gardens workshops and Beyond Gardens workshops. So a fountain of knowledge. If you ever see him running pruning workshops or food forest workshops, I mean, he doesn't call it food forest, it's called orchards. But you know, he's saying the same kind of information. They're well worth getting to. So this idea of what is the function of the plants. So carrots, yes, they will give us a yield and we might eat 75% of the carrots that we plant, but 25% of them are left to go to seed, deliberately to feed predators. Also, I mean, it's not just a waste. What happens, so this has lovely umbellifer flowers, this carrot, a little couple of ferny leaves. I'm a wonderful artist. And what happens to the carrot if we don't eat it? Rots. So what's rotting vegetation in the ground? Mulch, compost. I mean, there's a fellow called Fukuoka, a Japanese fellow that practiced natural agriculture and sort of pioneered these thought processes that Bill Mollison and other permaculturalists built on. He used to plant daikon radish everywhere. If you've ever seen a daikon radish, it's about this long and about that round. He maybe ate 1 in 100. The rest of them were left there as compost pots. And so what happens when a huge thing goes down into soil like this, it decompacts it, and when it rots away, it just makes this little worm farm in ground. So I mean, we can actively do lots of work to make compost every day, or we can just grow nature and let it do its thing. So the idea of the food forest is to set up a system that is looking after itself fertility-wise in time. That's a really nice mechanism to have in there to get bulk compost in the ground. And the beauty of nature is, you know, it doesn't just die. It produces flowers, and those flowers feed the insects and the predatory things that we need. And nature's a funny thing. It seems to do things at the right time as well. You know, so the time that it's flowering there and you're getting all these beneficials is the same time as the pests are smashing your other crops, and you just sit there going, I wonder if this is a coincidence. I find myself saying, I wonder if this is a coincidence every day. And, you know, the more coincidences I see, once is a coincidence, second is a fluke, and third is a pattern. And, you know, the more you look in your garden, the more you observe nature, the more you appreciate that there's patterns and rhythms and cycles everywhere. And the more we sort of put some good stuff in place and then stand back and watch our good work and feel good about it and enjoy nature, the more we see all these inherent jobs being done for us. Whenever we do something out of natural patterns or natural system or natural order, it's called work. So whenever we can avoid work, that should be a positive thing. Yep.
So then if you're growing carrots that are not hybrid, you can then use those seeds to grow your next generation of carrots too.
Lovely. Yep. So definitely, when we talk about a seed saving workshop, and the most important information I tell people is buy open pollinated seeds. Hybrids, they're not what we're after. Heritage, yeah, nice. Heirloom, nice. But what we just want is open pollinated seeds. So that plant can go to seed, drop on the ground if we don't have time to harvest it, and grow again. And again, because we're working with nature, the best seed bank, and the only seed bank in nature, is the soil. It's the best place to keep seeds. Plus, it's actually seasonally appropriate. The temperature of the soil changes and the moisture changes when the plant should grow. So we don't have to start guessing or reading what to plant when guides, trying to figure out when we should plant these broad beans, because the broad beans are in the ground, waiting for nature's cues to grow. When plants will grow that way, they grow much more happily and with much more success. So, every time we can engineer our work in the garden, we should be pretty interested in that, because that gives us a more self-resilient garden. I've been really busy lately, and my garden is a lot more dilapidated than I'd like, but the default position in my garden is overproductivity. So if I leave it for a month, I've got to go out with a machete. And sweet potato taken over, this plant's taking over, it's that pruning. So I've got the food forest model happening, and my management is pruning. When I have an extra 20 hours a week, I can plant a vegetable garden in there and manage the vegetable garden. And the system will be so good and healthy that it doesn't even blink. I don't have to add lots of manure and other things to grow these veggies. The system had the capacity. The person without the capacity was me, so I didn't have the time. So the idea of a food forest is you've just got this bank of resources that's ever increasing out there, and you can apply a tax to it in harvesting, and you can apply work to it as you have it, as opposed to having to get out there for 2 hours a week, otherwise everything's dead. So it's a nice little a resilient system of gardening where the default position is productivity, the default position is nature and natural order. And occasionally, that's right, you have to take the chainsaw out or the machete out and do some pruning. But that pruning is not that much work. It's taken me 2 days to defoliate half a dozen trees and prune out things and pile up these huge piles of mulch. And we practice something called chop and drop mulching. So we're not putting it into the mulching machine and getting it into tiny little bits and then moving it around and piling up a hot compost pile. And it doesn't take 40 hours to turn that vegetative garden material into soil material. We just chop it out of the tree, chop it into small enough bits and drop it at the bottom of the tree. Because what would be the best minerals and the best mulch and compost to be using on any plant?
What it's had itself.
Yeah, itself, because guess what? It's got its mineral. So if you've remineralized the soil to start with, everything that the plant needs is in the plant. So when we cut a third of the plant on, we put it on the verge for council pickup, and then we go back down to Bunnings, buy another bag of stuff, and then grow some more plant, and then prune it, and then put it back on the verge, and then go buy some more stuff. I mean, it's a no-brainer, but that is what everyone does, all the time. So if we have these, these non-veggie patch, more robust garden systems, we can be throwing more robust garden material on them. So what happens in a forest when the branches fall down and leaves fall down and the bark falls down? Someone doesn't go in there and pile it up and put it on the verge. Nature has these mechanisms, bacteria and fungi and other things that break down and give a really nice system for trees to grow in. So when we think about trees, we think about relationships with fungi. That's another important characteristic of trees. Trees work well with fungi in the soil. Fungi work well in the soil with hard lignins and chips like nitrogen-fixing bacteria and other things that build soil fertility for vegetables and annuals. That's a bacterial type arrangement. Now we can have both happening, but veggie gardens are predominantly bacterial zones with a bit of fungi action. Forests are predominantly fungi with a bit of bacterial action. So, it's not exclusive, but if we know that we want to have healthy trees and plants, and it's a tree-based system, we know we want to be trying to get a fungal soil system. One of the best ways to get that is the mulch. Hard, coarse, woody mulch. So, is it a problem that we've got all this hard, coarse, woody mulch, or is it actually what we need to get the fungal systems working? It's what we need. So you can either go and buy it from MulchNet or buy bags of mulch and throw it around your garden. And that may be well worth doing while you're establishing a food forest. Somewhere like under there, under those little fruit trees up there, mulch on top of them. Yep, definitely let's do that. But in time, let's actually prune the plants and use the plant prunings in the system as the coarse mulch. So you know how I said we put in lots of effort early in the food forest, but in time it becomes self-reliant. Our work is in pruning the plant and putting it under the plants and giving it back its own fertility. So if it grows more each year with free sunlight and free water, at least in winter, we really shouldn't be doing all this work and buying all these inputs to grow trees. No one is doing work and buying inputs to grow forests. So that's that mentality, that's that idea that we're trying to copy. So I digressed a bit, that happens. So the idea of looking at function. What is it that we're planting the trees for? We could plant a guild that is based on feeding predatory insects. We could plant a guild, and there's one in your notes on the front page, that is about feeding a citrus tree. So we can either apply bulk fertiliser, like most people advise you to do with the citrus. Every 3 months you need to fertilise the citrus so you can get enough oranges, because you literally take 50 kilos of oranges off an orange tree a year. You can't take 50 kilos out of the system and walk away and expect the system not to go into decline. So in that situation, we've got plants underneath that build fertility. We've got things like comfrey. Comfrey have a really deep root system. So if our orange has a shallow root system for a tree, blobby tree, fairly shallow root system of an orange, goes out to about the drip line. Have you heard the terminology drip line? Drip line's just the edge of the canopy. That's in nature where all the fertility in the water rolls off the plant and drips to the edge. So it's actually a zone that the plant deliberately goes to because that's where fertility in water accumulates. Some will come down the plant, but the more evergreen the plant is, the more it sheds to that line. So that's where the action is on that citrus. But you know, if this is 50 centimetres or half a metre, that's where the action ends if you've just got a citrus tree. It's not what we want. Perhaps we might even have like a taller deciduous tree out the back, like a pecan, with huge roots coming down, leaf litter raining down all the time. In winter, feeding time, we might have a chicken run here. So there's a fairly serious fertility engine coming this way of chicken poo and heavily mulched chickens. I won't try and draw a chicken because that would just be too humorous. But underneath that citrus tree, we've actually created some microclimate. If the sun is up here at 80-ish degrees in summer, and over here at 35 degrees in winter, or 32 or whatever it is, sunlight comes in like that in winter. So it's different in summer. In summer, sunlight comes down and stops there. So this idea of creating different niches or different microclimates within the garden, this is what we're talking about. Trees will create that space. Something like comfrey, which is a really good tap-rooted plant with broad leaves, really high mineralisation, its roots go down at least a metre, and then the relationships with fungi and bacteria in the soil with the comfrey might go down another couple of metres. We really don't understand how the soil food web works. We know that plants use photosynthesis to grow sugar, candy, and they feed it to fungi and bacteria who can't do photosynthesis, and they trade it for minerals and useful things out of the soil that the tree can't reach. That's all the tree can reach. That orange tree is very quickly going to run out of nutrients because it just doesn't have a very good reach. So we need to have a healthy soil food web under here, which is a term you might not have heard, but that's the idea of all of the good things in the soil we call a soil food web. They're all connected, they all balance each other out, they harvest minerals, they cycle minerals, they do all the good stuff. So a healthy living soil could be called a soil food web. So have a look at that after the workshop. All of these kind of discussions are on our website in the workshop notes section. So this comfrey, is doing this kind of thing. It's going down a lot further than the orange. What it's doing, it's known, it just puts up these big leaves and the leaves die and it composts. And then it pulls up more nutrients and those leaves die and compost. More nutrients die and compost. So all that plant is doing, it's just a nutrient pump. Water and fertility, it pumps out of the ground and it flops on top. That's exactly what you need under a citrus that needs all that fertility. The other thing is, the comfrey actually gets killed in the summer in the sun. So if we put the comfrey out here, it would die. So let's put it under the shade in summer, under the citrus tree, where it actually can live in summer and still function in summer. So that's that placement, thinking about your sun angles and your plant stacking. There's some intelligence in this. This space here is still useful. We might have we might get some food out of this. We might put some sage in here, something that likes sun, an edge plant. So we could have sage. That's something for us, but it doesn't tax the system much. We might have something called, everyone calls it alfalfa. I call it lucerne. It's the same plant. Alfalfa is easier to spell. It's the same plant. It's a perennial. So I haven't talked about perennials and annuals much. An annual is a plant that goes through its life cycle in a year, and it might be 3 months or it might be a full year. A biennial is something that might take 2 years to go through its life cycle, like a carrot or a beetroot. So it grows and it forms its plant, but it doesn't form its seeds until the second year. Then the idea of a perennial is something that's around for more than 2 years. So it's a plant that's there, and it may just vegetate with seeds, or it might be a plant like a Queensland arrowroot or a garlic or something that also propagates by rhizomes or bulbs or something like that. So you can call that a perennial food source as well. If we know that these plants are going to be around for more years, that's probably what we want to be working into the understory predominantly. So this idea of perennial vegetables, perennial herbs, perennial fruits, that's really what we're trying to work into the food forest. There's lots of space for annuals, but the system has to germinate it, or we have to plant it every year if it's an annual. So it's nice if we can work in a lot of perennials into the system so that we don't have to do that work each year. Perennials also lend themselves to low effort, low yield for us. Now that could be an issue, we could be upset about that, but realistically that means that's sustaining itself. So, yeah, except after C. So the stacking and the useful space and the putting plants that are not in competition. So 2 orange trees, or if we put a tomato in here, suddenly the tomato has shallow roots and it's a bulk feeder too. So it's in direct competition with the orange. Doesn't mean you can't put it there, but if you do put that plant there, you're going to have to be adding lots and lots of compost and food, because you're sort of not following natural patterns. Now we can choose to do that, and we might have space limitations in our block. We might decide that we're going to bring in quite a bit of compost in our block because we don't have enough space to grow lots of nitrogen-fixing trees or carbon plants or something like that. But this is a choice we make. It's decisions again. We're thinking about this. We're saying, well, I could have banner grass, I could have arrowroots, I could have things that I can chop and drop down to form carbon and grow the soil food web, but they take up space I don't have. I'm just going to bring in compost, and I'm going to grow all edible food plants, or useful high yield food plants. So we might just to what did I do with it? Just to work through visualising the food forest concept again, we might run through a little activity on the whiteboard. We'll also run through a bit of an underplanting of one of the trees, but that may be after the workshop, just to sort of, those trees are out by themselves, they would prefer to have an understory. Those trees would also prefer to have an overstory, because those trees don't exist in nature out in the desert sun, which is effectively what we have in Perth. Most of those trees are understories in rainforest. Mango is, guava is, apple is a hedgerow temperate plant that is underneath other plants. So even in Europe, apples don't exist out by themselves in nature. Macadamia, you think of a macadamia as a hardy bush food. It grows in rainforest as an understory, and then it comes out through the rainforest. So when it's young, it's not hardy at all. So, you know, we really have to think about trees a little bit more and help them out when they're young. When they get big and when they have relationships and friends, then they're bulletproof. While they're young, we need to look after them.
Sasa, and the email change maybe, or no?
Do you want to do it on this side? Yep. Oh, you can place the elements.
I see.
I might start with summer. We've got, let's pretend that way.
That's it.
So we're pretending that way is north in Perth. Saying the sun is radiating down from over here. Just done a few pictures because I work better with pictures than words. We're talking about the layering that Charles has touched on. Talk about a canopy layer. We've got our first highest layer, which is the canopy layer. This time I've just chosen an evergreen for this location, and you'll see why that fits in a bit later.
Chuck, we can't.
It's winter, it's summer, so we've got the sun overhead. When it's winter, the sun will be coming in from a more northerly direction. We're 2D on a 3D screen.
Charles.
What I'm going to do is just go through the layers, and you'll see a couple of shapes of the layers, but then also look at what we talked about, the factor of deciduous versus evergreen, and that will then come in with our arrangement. This will give you sort of a picture in your mind's eye. So the next one down is we're talking about a lower tree layer, and there are different shapes, which is what Charles talked about.
Excuse me.
There's ones that go up in a triangle.
Charles,
Citrus do that
we
kind
can't
of
really
thing.
hear
narrow
very
at the
well.
base.
Can you put that to your?
It
There's
doesn't help
other
with
ones
the audio.
which look suspiciously like the conifer, but a lot look like this. Sorry? Speak up, alright? But you can imagine if you're trying to fit things into a smaller space, we're talking about harsh summer, so we're looking for shelter in this kind of aspect. The ability, obviously, to fit something, this shape, under the layer is much easier than the alternative. We've got our two layers. If we're stepping down, the next layer is the bush and shrub layer. Chosen evergreen at this point. But as you can tell, we're stacking in underneath, trying to avoid the harshness of the sun. And then we start getting, the next layer Charles talked about is the herbaceous layer, and we're packing these in, and I'm speaking to the whiteboard, sorry. We're packing these in nice and tight, capitalising on the amount of exposure we've got to the sun by covering up in the summer period.
Typical tree spacing might be 3 metres or 6 metres in some people's minds. In the food forest we're getting much closer. Because we're sharing resources and we're companion planting and we're trying to stop the harsh effects of the sun and to manage the nutrients and build the soil food web with a high density of action, we're going to plant things a lot closer than you would commercially in an orchard system. We have different needs to orchards, so we don't copy orchard systems. In a backyard, we're looking for different arrangement, higher diversity of plants, more frequent cropping of different things all year round. In an orchard, they're planting 1 or 2 or 3 varieties of plants, they're harvesting it within a month, and it's all going out and being shipped out. We don't really want that kind of arrangement happening because that just gives us big gluts of food and no food for a long time.
Alright, the next layer down is the ground cover layer. Can we put out here if we're talking about getting that visual on the rundown of the thing? But just as likely, it's coming in and it's getting protected. So we get the visual here. I'm not saying that that's where it must go, but it's showing where it's going.
We'll have different types of ground cover. We'll have some that are low light ground covers like strawberries and violets and comfreys. You can call that a ground cover. And then you might have high sun ground covers like sweet potato and warrigal greens and some of the succulents that are quite sun tolerant. So same kind of growth form, quite different functions and quite different needs from a water and a sunshine perspective.
And that introduces nicely as well that the form of the plants, which I think Charles said earlier, can be changed. So if we're then talking about tubers as the next lot, start to see that, well, if we're talking about the sweet potato, we've got 2 functions coming in, or you can trellis up your sweet potato and start to form that more covering canopy aspect. So there's different things that you can do with each item, but for the time being we're talking about this being small. We've then got our edible roots, so we talked about them, more growth underground, less above, but again, make some changes there depending on how you're going to grow. And that is the key 7 layers. There's a couple of additional layers. There's the vertical layer, which Charles talked about. So if you imagine it coming up in here, this kind of thing.
Vines or vertical layer, whatever you want to call it. If your structure's a deciduous tree, then you're mad not to have vines going up it in winter. If it's an evergreen, then perhaps there's too much competition in there and it's not a particularly good association to have something trying to grow through a citrus tree, because the citrus tree wants all the sunlight and it's making good use of it. If it's a pear or an apricot or an apple or something that's losing its leaves, then why not grow something up it in winter? We're growing things like snow peas and things in winter, something that needs a trellis but is going to be gone by the time that the tree comes into production is sounding like a good companion to be using on something like that. We don't want to be putting a passion fruit up, we don't want to be growing a grapevine up it, but we can use that structure and fit more in there and get a yield. Often in agriculture that's called a opportunistic yield catch crop. Cash crop, yeah. So it sort of fits in between other things, but you're actually getting a yield out of it for no real effort or, extra fertiliser or extra time in your crop rotation.
Yep. And the last one, which I reckon is the most important, the one we've added to the standard, is the fungi layer. Because as we talked about, building that up is a key driver of feeding an entire system. And it's one that you think about when you're setting up. You don't actually have a huge amount of control over the expansion of the fungi layer, but you certainly have a huge amount of control over the killing or removal or inhibiting its growth. So it's just being aware of it and how we're growing it. So essentially we've covered the layers in a nice visually pictorial. Charles has stolen my... So in summer, when we have obviously the sun, it's not coming in this way, but if we're talking about the sunlight coming just about straight down, as we said, it's sort of that 82 degrees coming in here. If you've got another canopy layer tree over on this side, you've got extra protection across your system. Similarly, you've
you've got options of evergreen and deciduous in your other layers. And then if you imagine we're switching now to winter, where everybody wants the light, not the protection, and you're moving, so the sun is now coming in at that lower angle. So for us, that's obviously there as opposed to the straight up. Then you've got the option of your deciduous tree, or you, given it's not really cold enough, you might have to make it deciduous. You've got this guy being taken out of that. Yes, there's a block of shade, but you've obviously you're letting the light through in that period when light catchment is the free energy, and we're almost at that edge of having too little.
This is the kind of thing we're doing on the west side of our block, when we're getting that afternoon sun coming in summer and it's way too hot and it's a very low sun angle, and our solar passive home design and windows and shutters and other things, the eaves are not doing the job. We can plant deciduous trees. We certainly want that sunlight in winter coming into our house, but we want to keep it out in summer. We're doing a similar thing here for the food forest. The food forest doesn't want late afternoon sun in summer. It's killing the food forest. But it does want all the sun in winter. So the same kind of design and techniques that we're using in the food forest, we can use to buffer our house on the west and northern side as well.
Just a question in regards to planting gills. I can see an opportunity if you had a bit more land space to have a east-west row of gills that perhaps are evergreen characteristic, and in front of that would be the deciduous.
Yep.
That way you'd be able to get a little bit more of things working together, and you're working in seasons when you want the light as opposed to not wanting the light.
Absolutely. So the better farmers out there are now starting to plant windrows in between their paddocks, intelligent windrows that are gills. So they've got stock fodder plants on the edge near the fence. They've got large evergreens and lower evergreens as a windbreak to stop and make it nicer on the wind downwind side. And they've got deciduous and evergreens in there for more production. So they're feeding bees, they've got leaf drop and an extra food production, they've got fodder for animals, and they've got this shelter belt arrangement happening, as you say, east-west, alleys, setting up beautiful grazing areas for cattle. And then when you extend that more into silvoforestry or agroforestry and tree plantings, people are actually growing trees and tree crops and vegetables and animals in quite narrow spaces. Similar techniques to this, it's just understanding how nature works, putting all of the good things together so that nature is actually working together to achieve more fertility and better nutrient management. And obviously there's this concept of yield in permaculture, and every little thing you put in the system gives you the opportunity to take a yield off it. If you call it a 10% tax, whatever you want to call it, there's the opportunity to get a yield from every bit of thing that's in the system. We're not trying to kill it or tax it and make it die out, but it gives us a bit of opportunity for a harvest. So if we can get something from everything, we want more stuff or less stuff in there. We want a higher diversity. So the higher diversity we stack in the system, the higher diversity of yield we get, and the higher yield we get out of a system. Hence statements like the sum of the parts is greater than the whole. So, if you just have an orange in there, yes, you're going to get 50 kilos of orange. If you have an orange with a food forest in there, you're probably going to get 45 kilos of oranges. Predatory feeding, soil fertility for free, an area for the chickens because they need heavy shade in summer because it's too hot. Fruit fly control. So when we start putting all these things together, we have a really resilient natural system without us needing to do copious amounts of work because it's artificial.
And all I was going to say is, as we're talking about, just because it's evergreen doesn't mean it has to stay evergreen. You can do work in a system to then, that's my fancy pruning. I prune on the garden. So I've pruned it. There's suddenly a huge amount of growing space underneath it, and we've got even more of these guys in winter able to capitalise because perhaps we've got more light coming in depending on how close, but obviously we have to think set this up on how we're going to get lighting at that angle when we hit the winter. And that's coming back to the importance of understanding, we started out with that, of the angle that the light will be coming in on, and therefore which direction you need to think about, either your deciduous or your the work you're going to do to enable you to put all these guys in a smaller space as possible.
So when we're not looking at annual veggie plots, element is something we put into a system. But if we were thinking about natural patterns, where do worms live naturally? In the ground and in the soil. So if we've got a healthy food forest with shade and moisture and all good things happening, and we actually want worms to cycle our nutrients and our compost and our chop and drop mulch in there, then I would aim to have a worm farm in there that I don't have to manage. But you can have a worm farm. You just need to, all of these is a decision-making process. So what does a worm farm give me? It gives me really nice colloidal, really fine material that's good for growing seedlings. So perhaps if I was growing a lot of seedlings, then having a worm farm where I could collect worm castings and use that as a seedling mix, that's sounding like a good kind of arrangement.